Thank you. The next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 19319 in the name of Daniel Johnson on welcoming the report by Royal College of Psychiatrists on support for neurodevelopmental conditions. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would ask those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Daniel Johnson to open the debate. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank members from across the Chamber who supported my motion to enable this debate to take place, because I think it is important. Important for a number of different reasons. Important to discuss the recommendations in the report, but also I think important so that we can actually mark the progress we've made, because it's just a little bit more than 8 years since I first stated in this Parliament that I have ADHD and I take medication for that. It was then in 2018 that I held, I think it was the first debate to discuss ADHD by itself in this place, and I think we have made much progress. When I reflect upon the context that we had then and one we have now, I think it's much easier to talk about ADHD. I think there's much greater understanding and acceptance of that. And indeed, I find myself attending NHS briefings and other meetings, and I'm not the only person raising it as an issue. I find colleagues across the Chamber finding equal importance and raising the issues, and that is fantastic. But I also think there's been an odd flipping of the situation, because back then, in 2017, there was a stigma. It was difficult to speak up, and the government very often found itself justifying why diagnosis and prescribing was taking place. But now we have public demand for diagnosis, for assessment, for prescribing, and the government explaining why that's not taking place, and most recently, and I think we need to talk about this this afternoon, about why diagnosis isn't required. And I think that's dangerous, and I think we need to take care, because there is a scale of the problem that we have to consider. There's 42,000 children waiting for assessment. That's a 500% increase. We have 23,000 adults waiting for assessment. That's a 2,200% increase. And unfortunately, these are numbers that we've had to rely on the Royal College of Psychiatrists to produce, because they're not numbers the Scottish Government is producing. But behind that is actually a cost, a scale, not just in the frustration and human misery that a failure to diagnose, a failure to provide support comes. There's a real economic cost. It's estimated that undiagnosed autistic spectrum disorder costs the economy £44 billion, undiagnosed ADHD £17 billion. When you look at the prison population, the fact that 25% of the prison population is estimated to have ADHD against 3 to 5% of the general population, there is a real cost of failure here, one that we have to address. Indeed, there isn't a single neurodevelopmental condition that isn't overrepresented in the prison population by at least threefold. That's why I think this report by the Royal College of Psychiatrists is so important, because it actually sets out a very clear plan of what we can do now, both in terms of wider policy, but also in terms of clinical action and policy to address this issue. Now, just on this point around not needing a diagnosis, there are important recommendations in here, particularly of the 10 recommendations, 1, 2 and 5, about non-clinical pathways, about the way we can adjust approaches in education and indeed wider public policy that can help people with ADHD and autism. Looking at the practical, reasonable adjustments that don't need a diagnosis in order to take place. There's also points 9 and 10 about wider understanding and improving that across the general population, and those are important. But let's be very clear. The bulk of these recommendations are about clinical pathways, are about access to diagnosis. Explicitly, recommendation number 3 talks about the increase in access to medication. Increase in access to medication. That's not denying that medication is important, because let me be very clear, and I've been clear about this in the past. Medication, for many people, and certainly for me, was the biggest single step that I could take to helping me with my condition. It is the thing. There are many people approach me, and they do constantly. They say that it helps them in terms of their ability to hold down a job, to maintain their relationships with their family, deal with the chaos that ADHD often brings. But it also sets out in the other recommendations in the Royal College of Psychiatrists report about the need for new guidelines, including new sign guidance. We don't have any sign guidelines for ADHD. We need new general adult psychiatric standards, and we need a 4-tiered model to accessing diagnosis and support. This is clear and it's practical. But let me also just pull out one other features. I think we need to tackle head-on primary care. And within the recommendations here, within recommendations 3 and 4, the Royal College of Psychiatrists are explicit. We need to bring forward a structure and means by which GPs can actively participate in prescribing. That we have seen changes and advances in our understandings of that condition, because I think that is critical. Because let's talk about the other elephant in the room, shared care. Because the reality is that GPs across this country have stopped doing what was once understood and received practice of entering into shared care on the basis of a private diagnosis. Now, I don't think you should have to have a private diagnosis to get the treatment you want. I don't want a system that relies upon that at all. But we need a pragmatic approach, because the reality is this. In recent months, I've had lots of conversations, and GPs will tell you that they're not allowed to do shared care anymore. That's not true. Health boards are clear that it's not them preventing that. Indeed, even the local medical committees say that what they have produced, the guidelines, aren't a prohibition. And yet we seem to have a situation where health boards, GPs, local medical committees are doing a kind of a mutual blame activity here, all pointing the finger in other directions. We need a pragmatic approach, one where we recognise that very often these private diagnoses are being undertaken by the very same people that would be undertaking NHS diagnosis. So can we have a practical approach, a standardisation as called for about what good diagnosis looks like, and so that we can actually accept diagnosis that has occurred elsewhere? Very happy to give, but I have to be brief.
Sanjay Gohani.
Declaration of interest of practicing NHS GP. The issue is the shared care. When you have a private diagnosis, it is no longer shared care because you are no longer seeing that private consultant. So what we really need is that diagnosis being transferred into the NHS for that shared care to happen.
Daniel Johnson.
And actually, the standardised approach, I think, adopts that point. But it is shared care if you are continuing to see that private practitioner, but the GP prescribing. But we need some standardisation. I think we need pragmatism. But above all else, I think we need clarity. So what I would say to the Minister is this: let's have the numbers. Let's understand how many people are waiting. Let's have clear, standardised approaches, and let's have a plan to clear this backlog, because behind it is tens of thousands of people in crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. We now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Paul McLennan to be followed by Sanjay Gohani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I thank Daniel Johnson for bringing this debate to the Chamber today. Daniel and I have had a couple of chats about this over the last couple of months. It's an issue that we're all aware of through our constituents. It's obviously multi-layered and it's multi-agency, and impacts on families, children and health, obviously, and in education setting. And like many others, I've met with the RCP in Scotland just last week about the report in terms of that. And there's a few things I think that's coming through, and I think one of the key things, obviously, it does impact on many aspects of people's lives. It's major emotional, social and health impacts. The point that Daniel Johnson has made around about access to diagnosis and medication is incredibly important. An issue around about GPs, and we've discussed this at Lothian Health Board, for example, and health boards. The standardisation point is really, really important, because there are different aspects from different GPs in terms of that. So Daniel's touched upon the number of people it impacts, and the NDCs impact roughly 10 to 15% of the population, and it's good now that people actually begin to talk around about this, and I think NDCs are probably significantly underdiagnosed. In terms of that, we heard about the referrals and the increase in referrals alone, and I think referrals to health boards increased between 500% and 800% across health boards between 2019 and 2021. Now, that's been driven, I think, by several factors. One, society is made more aware of it. And I think there's unmet historical needs, and obviously there's population growth. And there's no denying the impact of COVID as well. The key thing, I think, for me, and this is what the RCP kind of said this as well in terms of this, weren't exactly saying the debate was around about finance, and I'll touch on that in a second. It was around about the standardisation of some of the referrals of treatment and support pathways that are there, and I'll be keen to pick up from the Minister in terms of that. And we've had, again, a quick chat with the Minister on that particular point. I think without a nationally agreed pathway, it does make this really difficult in terms of how we can see things moving forward. And pressure is only going to grow, I think, in the next number of months and years as people become more aware of it. In terms of that, it's an issue that constituents come to me on a regular basis. And again, even within East Lothian, in terms of how the GPs deal with that is very different. So what's the future? And again, this is the key thing that the RCP report talked about. And there are some lessons. I think the National Autism Implementation Plan carried out a feasibility study for the pathway in 2021. It mentioned a few things, and we're still going to, I think, talking into that now. One was talking about the pathways. There is still a need, obviously, for pathways, and that's to replace almost like the single condition approaches, and I think that's incredibly important, and that has to be accessible over the 14 health boards. In terms of that, again, Daniel Johnson talked about the need to deliver local stepped care pathway models. Now, I interact with an organisation called Stand, who are very active in East Lothian, and this is one of their key aims that they talk around about that. And it does include the third sector and community services, and that's access to self-help, peer support and a range of other services during and, of course, after diagnosis. So there's a key other recommendations, I think, that are keen to be taken forward. It's obviously talking about a governance framework, the need for a competency-building framework at all levels of service provision. And Daniel Johnson touched about the delivery of the 4 points. I think it's been mentioned by the RCP. One was obviously about the national public health approach, and that's about developing a public health campaign to promote awareness and understanding of the conditions, including and emphasising self-management, national self-help resources, and that's creating a centralised platform to provide comprehensive self-help. Specialist third sector commissioning for NDC, and again this has to be localised, and we've had this discussion with Lothian Health Board in terms of that as well. And Lothian Health Board themselves mention, and it's almost that blame game talking about how the GPs in terms of that, so we need to clear that up. And I think one of the key things as well is obviously around about how we prioritise investment in developing that, and this is obviously talking about the multidisciplinary approach, which include clinicians and include GPs in terms of that. So we could talk about this for much longer, but in conclusion, I just thank Daniel Johnson for bringing this forward, the debate today. It's an issue that's going to continue to be debated in here, and I look forward to hearing from the Minister, particularly in the RC report, on the debate. But thank you, President Officer.
Thank you, Mr McLennan. I call Stanish Gohanis to be followed by Cara Mochan.
Thank you. The Royal College of Psychiatrists report lays out in clear and evidence-based terms what many of us have been warning for years. Demand has soared. As of March 2025, over 42,000 children and 23,000 adults were waiting for a neurodevelopmental assessment. This is not a marginal increase. Children's weights have risen by over 500%, adults by 2,200% since 2020. These numbers represent lives on hold, children becoming adults and being sent to the back of the queue again, parents in despair and adults left without clarity, without support and without hope. But let's be clear, the scale of this crisis is not simply the result of increased demand. It is also because the government for years reassured themselves that everything was fine. And it most certainly wasn't fine. And shamefully, they knew it, because they conflated data, changed the way data was collected, and then used flawed data to game the system. Now, the Royal College's recommendations aren't radical. They're not rocket science. As Daniel Johnson has said, access to medication is pretty basic. They are basic building blocks of a functioning system. A clear national pathway, timely diagnosis, timely treatment and seamless support. These are things the SNP government should have put into place years ago. Instead, we have chaos. Data collection is fundamentally poor. NHS Grampian can't separate neurodevelopmental cases from CAMS data. We cannot even understand the scale of need. NHS Lanarkshire provided data 2 years out of date. And when you phone the board, you learn the real waiting time is 2 years longer than they publicly reported. This isn't transparency, of course.
Daniel Johnson.
Does Sandesh Gahani agree with me that it's very confusing that when health boards say they can't report that data, but then they can say how long people are going to wait. They clearly know what people are waiting for, but they're not reporting it. Does that not confuse him as well?
Sanish Gohani.
It absolutely does confuse me. And actually, when you see what they're saying to their patients on waiting times and what they publish, they're completely separate. And we have that from NHS Lanarkshire. And it's not transparency, it's obfuscation. It's unacceptable, because without accurate data, how could you possibly plan your service? Without a clear pathway, people will fall through the cracks, and this is placing intolerable pressure on an already overstretched mental health system. We know the consequences. We've heard Daniel Johnson speak of them, but we have worse educational outcomes, higher rates of unemployment, significantly overrepresentation of autism and ADHD individuals in the criminal justice system. Untreated ADHD increases the risk of substance misuse. Untreated autism increases the risk of anxiety, depression and suicide. Early diagnosis isn't optional. It's life-changing and actually life-saving. Minister Tom Arthur has called for a roundtable for the 15th of December. Now, I'll be honest, I'm sceptical. We've had countless roundtables before. We've had warm words, but what we rarely see is action. So I'd like to put a few questions. Since the Minister appeared before the Health Committee on October the 28th, what has actually been done? Has he met with health boards to ensure data is appropriately collected? Is reliable data now being collected? What steps have been taken to ensure transparency? Scotland needs a multi-system, society-wide response. We cannot simply expand broken structures. We need coherent pathways from diagnosis to treatment to long-term support, and we need it now. The Royal College has done its job, and it's time for the Scottish Government to do theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr Gohani. I call Cara Mochan to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Daniel Johnson for bringing this very important debate to the Chamber. Daniel Johnson, working with other members cross-party, has been a real champion in this Parliament for people with autism, ADHD and neurodevelopmental conditions. This report adds to the growing body of evidence that change is needed in our approach to assessment, diagnosis and support in respect of neurodivergence in Scotland. Members might be aware that the Health, Social Care and Sports Committee earlier this year held an inquiry giving people and families experiencing neurodevelopmental services the opportunity to share experiences and recommend changes to ensure we can better serve our neurodiverse constituents. I look forward to that report being published. It was an important investigation and I think many lessons learned, and I hope the report will reflect this and be usefully added to other work ongoing in this area. The Royal College report rightly points out that despite the dramatic rise in need, Scotland still lacks dedicated standardised pathways. They go on to say, in the absence of appropriate services, individuals are being referred into general adult mental health pathways, not because they have a mental illness, but because there is no suitable alternative. Now, what they point out is that these services have never been designed to assess or support these conditions and have just become a catch-all, is how it's described, for these referrals. This structural mismatch is now overwhelming the system, which is what we have all been talking about, and waiting lists have grown to very unmanageable levels. So it is important that this is addressed. I think members will recognise what the report is saying, and I really wanted to raise the voice of my constituents. The frustration of people and families, I don't think can be understated. Over the 4 years that I have been in the Parliament, it is one of the most frequent requests in casework. And I have said this before, but it's often a very simple request. People asking us, please can you help me understand waiting lists for people? Please can you help me understand service provision for people with autism, ADHD or neurodiversions? And can you help me with primary school or secondary school, or as I move between primary, secondary and further education? Families are often finding themselves in conflict. Of course.
Polly McNeill.
Thank you very much. I wonder if the member is aware or agrees that historically ADHD has been underdiagnosed in girls and women due to differences in symptom presentation. While boys often display hyperactivity and externalised behaviours, girls may show inattentiveness, emotional sensitivity and internalised struggles. I think it's only just been realised by the profession, and does the member agree that it's maybe part of the strategy to focus a bit on girls and women.
Cara Morgan.
Thank you. I really thank the member for a really important intervention, and I have had that raised through casework myself as well. So I believe that colleagues in the Chamber have had very similar requests from constituents. More recently is the incredible stressful use of the private sector for assessment. Others have mentioned that. Many children, and in fact we know now adults, are seeking private assessment. This is after many attempts to get assessment through the National Health Service. But the long waiting list and lack of service means exhausted families use often much of their money and much of the resources to get a diagnosis, and it's very stressful. And it's clear that after they do this, there is no clear pathway for them. Many of us in the Chamber have heard how poorly coordinated shared care, and it's been mentioned, I won't go over that again. But families are often rejected, not just for medication, but from GPs, from CAM services. And within our education system, a constituent has raised with me very similar situations where parents seek a diagnosis and then children are denied within the education situation community services such as OT or speech and language therapy because the private diagnosis doesn't link in with the school's way of recording and reporting and supporting people. Parents report to me that they feel public services, that's health services, social care, education, criminal justice, lack a basic understanding on the front line. And I think that's an important point, and I will finish on this point, Presiding Officer, that resources are often there, but at what was described to me as quite a high level, and it's how do we get that front line team to be able to pick up on those issues. I would have liked to say more, but I do appreciate time. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Hawken. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Brian Whistle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I congratulate Daniel Johnson for securing this important debate. Now, Mr Johnson and I, co-hosted the event in October. The paper was launched in the morning, and we had the event took place later in the morning, where some colleagues came to ask questions. It's a really helpful session, I thought, to be quite honest. Now, this paper, for me, is a really important offer to all of society in Scotland, quite frankly. One of the key messages that came out of that session that morning was, and this is very unusual for events that we will all attend. Usually we go to events and it's always, can we get more money, more money, more money? But one of the key messages was that there's a lot of money, as Cara Morgan just touched upon, there's a lot of money already in the system that could be better invested in people. There was an ask, certainly, for more money, but it wasn't the key issue. Now, for me, the 10 recommendations in the report are extremely important. Now, I'm going to touch upon just 3. I think that the recommendations are helpful to engage and try to deliver better outcomes for autistic people and people with ADHD. And I've engaged extensively with constituents and also family members who who've got children with autism or ADHD. And I know that we've got that societal challenge in Scotland to try to address. But it's not just us. This is a situation that's happening across the world. But obviously in this Parliament it's about what we can do as parliamentarians. But it's a wider issue. Now, the document, I sent the document to constituents to let them obviously look at it, read it, digest it and make up their own minds as to what they think the document can actually do. Now, the 10 recommendations, they all have got merits, but there'll be some that have got some challenges to be delivered, particularly in a short timescale. Now, recommendation 1, which Daniel Johnson touched upon, for me is a really important recommendation here. Now, and I'll read out the title, certainly for the official report. It's the demand driven by the need for support in the workplace, in places of education, and from the benefits system. Now, I think this could be transformational in terms of healthcare to be offered, but also I think one of the challenges is the bit regarding the DWP. Clearly, we don't have that power here, but I think that is one that could be dealt with. Take a bit of time, but it could be dealt with. But certainly, constituents have raised issues regarding the diagnosis before care as a regular issue with me. And this is where I think the 5 suggestions in the recommendation could be beneficial, but I generally am of the opinion that some of them would be challenging to deliver, the DWP one in particular. Recommendation 2, the public health informed approach. That makes sense, and that could be done very much as a quick win if we can really kind of push for that. Recommendation 5 on page 15, the National Strategy and Resources. I think for me that's one of the most important recommendations. I am hearing from people concerned regarding the high percentage of people diagnosed with neurodevelopmental conditions. It's challenging those who need support and the more advanced support. This recommendation is crucial to help deliver some of that. Now, Presiding Officer, I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to go through all the recommendations, but I do welcome the paper. I think it's a helpful document, and the recommendations clearly can stimulate further discussion, further dialogue, but also decision-making, so that we can actually get better outcomes for people that we all represent. I know we do have societal challenges, but I do think that this paper can certainly help move that, move that dial. Healthcare professionals have provided a set of recommendations to help. They know there is money in the NHS system that could be better invested, and these recommendations are very much worthy of consideration and also that further discussion, because they genuinely could make a huge difference for people that we are here to represent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Millen. I call Brian Whittle to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank my friend and colleague Daniel Johnson for again bringing this debate to the Chamber, and I applaud his continuing drive to deliver that better pathway for those with neurodivergent conditions, and also for using his own experience to highlight that to us. I would also like to thank the Royal Society of Psychiatrists for their comprehensive report on ADHD and autism, and for those multi-solutions. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder involves differences in attention, impulsivity and hyperactivity. Now, Mr Johnson has delivered a very comprehensive review of the system's failings and the dire need to deliver support, and a national strategy for a hugely increasing number of people seeking assessment and support for neurodevelopmental conditions, with all the negative impacts associated with that lack of support. Now, I wasn't going to rehearse all of these important issues that Mr Johnson spoke to so well, but what I will do is I think the one that worries me the most is data collection. I think, and it's reared its head again, that inability of coherent, consistent data collection. And I've spoken many times about that universal system that's lacking within our health service that allows for that data collection. We're going to have, and one way or the other, we're going to have to address that in general across the health service, because it would be a huge tool as we tackle this particular issue. As I said, I'm not going to rehearse all of the important issues. Rather, Deputy Presiding Officer, I want to highlight one of my favourite topics, which is prevention. And I have to say that my limited experience here is in coaching athletes with autism and FASD. What I witnessed, of course.
Daniel Johnson.
I'll intervene very briefly. What I'd just like to emphasise, I very often say to people, beyond medication, the other critical factors are good sleep hygiene and exercise. And I would just like to say, I think access to sport is critical to helping people manage ADHD.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank Daniel Johnson for finishing my speech for me? What I was going to say is what I did witness was young people flourishing and developing in a training environment that delivered structure and self-discipline into their lives. It was really great to see, and one of them even ending up at college doing a course on health and fitness. But more telling for me, Deputy Presiding Officer, is what happened to them during COVID, when they were starved of that structure in their lives. Without that framework, that focus, there was a significant slide, much worse than the other athletes in the squad. One actually ended up not being able to control his eating while being unable to get out of the house and take part in activity, and ended up putting on so much weight he never got back to training. And he actually was an international athlete. So that access to activity, that pathway to self-expression and a route to channel that energy can be so important to some of those with these neurodevelopmental conditions, can help to give balance. And I did speak to the Royal Society of Psychiatrists and some autism third sector representatives to see if there was any agreement with the points I was exploring, and thankfully there was that agreement. So I take every opportunity to highlight the importance of sport and activity to the well-being of the nation. I would suggest in these instances it can be even more important. When we look at the unprecedented rise in the number of people seeking assessment, I would also suggest that the continued decline in the opportunities to be active, both in the school environment and in our communities, may be a contributing factor to this exponential rise in ADHD assessment requests. Now we consider these numbers have always been there under the surface, and I just wonder if, as part of this prevention and non-medicalisation, as Daniel Johnson put it, of the condition, there are numbers of those with neurodivergent conditions that would benefit from a reversal of declining opportunities to channel that hyperactivity. And on that, Deputy Presiding Officer, I would just thank Daniel Johnson once again for bringing this to the Chamber. Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. And I call Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too thank Daniel Johnson for bringing this to the Chamber, and also I would say his bravery in being so vocal about some of the challenges he's had. It's, you know, people I don't think appreciate that enough. My interest in this was triggered by the eminent Dr Premal Shah, who set up the Lothian Adult ADHD and ASD clinics. He's a long-term family friend and really quite the force in this area. I agree, I think the report is excellent. I really have enjoyed reading it, and I also congratulate the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland. I particularly liked the framing of it as a wicked problem, complex, interconnected, resistant to quick fixes, and we need to bear that in mind. It's not just a health issue, it's fundamentally a systemic challenge that touches every part of society. We know that neurodevelopment conditions intersect with education, employment, justice and social care. We know that people are being referred into mental health pathways that were never designed for them, and that, we can't forget, is overwhelming clinicians as well as delaying care for those with severe mental illness. Vacancies in psychiatry are rising, burnouts accelerating, and so it's fundamentally a system under strain from every angle. We've heard previously the figures on the waiting list for assessments, but some regions are facing delays of more than 5 years, and I would also concur that I've had really quite a high number of inquiries from my constituents about their own issues. I want to focus my brief remarks today on the financial cost to our economy, and we've heard again figures quoted, but these reflect directly into lost productivity, and we know the productivity challenges within Scotland and across the UK. Higher unemployment, increased reliance on benefits, businesses are losing skilled workers who cannot access timely support. Schools struggle to keep pupils engaged. That, of course, leads to lower educational attainment and reduced future earnings. The justice system bears additional costs through higher rates of offending linked to untreated conditions. So every delay in diagnosis and intervention translates into lost economic output and increased public spending. So that's a cycle we can't afford to ignore. We know that fundamentally funding is fragmented and it's insufficient. So unless we have these dedicated funding streams, we can't establish the specialist pathways needed. But the problem is complex, as I've said, and so are the mechanisms for funding. And I think we also need to acknowledge that. So I agree with the pragmatic approach suggested in the report that there should be interim, a separate funding stream dedicated to wider service development. And I think much greater thought is needed to the potential for digital solutions. And again, I absolutely reflect the complexity. It's easy to say, but coming from an IT background, I really appreciate how difficult it will be to do. But if we can start to unlock these data sources, it really would result in very powerful tools. So finally, picking up on some of the points around data, we can't solve what we cannot see, and I agree absolutely the need for robust data collection, but we also need that data disaggregated by sex, because we know that ADHD and autism presents differently in women and girls. We know that women are so much better at masking and using coping strategies to hide distress, but delay diagnosis. Girls are under-identified in childhood, and women can often reach a crisis point before receiving.
Briefly, because the member's about to conclude.
I am indeed. My last sentence, Presiding Officer. So without sex-specific data, we risk designing services that fail half the population. So it's not a technical detail, it's actually the foundation for equitable care. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Minister Tom Arthur to respond to the debate. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank members from across the Chamber for what I thought were a very thoughtful and constructive set of contributions this afternoon, and the strength of feeling that we have heard on behalf of autistic people, people with ADHD and those with other neurodevelopmental conditions, as well as their families and those who support them, underlines both the scale of the challenge and I think as well our collective determination to deliver meaningful change. And I also want to thank Daniel Johnson directly for bringing this debate and to acknowledge the important work of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland in producing its recent report. The College has made a valuable and timely contribution, and the Scottish Government welcomes its focus on multi-system reform, on early intervention and on support that is based on need, not simply on diagnosis. Those principles strongly echo our own approach and also reflect the perspective of professionals, families and those communities whose voices must continue to shape the way forward. Members are absolutely right to highlight the unprecedented increase in demand for neurodevelopmental assessment and support, and we are not alone in saying this. As I have said previously, this is a trend emerging right across the UK and internationally, with growing pressure on systems that were never built to manage demand on this scale. But we must meet this challenge, and we must do so in a way that recognises the diversity of neurodivergent people's experiences and the complexity of the systems they interact with across health, education and social care. And the members have spoken today about waiting times. We appreciate that waiting for assessment or support can be challenging, but we are working hard to make that experience better for individuals and families. A diagnosis can be profoundly important to a person's identity and understanding of themselves, and for some, particularly those seeking ADHD medication, it is essential. But diagnosis alone is not the solution. A traditional NHS waiting list model cannot meet the scale or complexity of the need we now face. And I've heard from many experts in this area about the risks in over-medicalising our response. As the Royal College itself has emphasised, what is required is a coordinated multi-agency response that focuses on timely, needs-based support from the outset. That's why for children and young people, the National Neurodevelopmental Specification sets a clear expectation that support should begin on the basis of need and not be contingent on a clinical diagnosis. Now, implementation has undoubtedly been challenging in the face of rising demand, but we have already taken significant steps. We have invested in service pilots, testing of digital assessment tools, family support initiatives and working to strengthen multi-agency pathways, building around our Getting It Right for Every Child national approach. We have also published the joint Scottish Government COSLA review of the implementation of the national specification. This identifies short, medium and long-term actions to support children's service partners to deliver the specification more effectively. And to drive this important work forward, we have established a new cross-sector task force, jointly chaired by senior leaders from education and health. And its purpose is clear, Presiding Officer, to accelerate and coordinate systems-wide improvement, drawing on lived experience, clinical expertise and good practice across Scotland. Happy to take it into action.
I'm very grateful for the Minister for giving way. I'm listening very intently to what he's saying there, and I agree with much of what he said. But I think the one thing that I would caveat that is there is a concern that by not getting a diagnosis, or by getting a diagnosis, there is a relief element in a lot of cases for people who could then recognise there is something that I need to deal with. There's a relief and a mental health issue around just getting that diagnosis.
Minister.
I appreciate the problems. One of the things that I want to be very clear on is when I emphasise the importance of a needs-based approach, I want to be absolutely crystal clear that I recognise the importance that is placed upon diagnosis, and I would not want my remarks unintentionally or intentionally to be misconstrued in any way, or to be suggestive of any language that relates to notions of overdiagnosis. I want to be very clear about the approach. What my focused on is ensuring is that people can access support as quickly as possible, and that diagnosis should not act as a barrier or as a means of gatekeeping to access that support. And I do recognise the importance, the great importance that is placed upon diagnosis for many, both with regards to identity and self-understanding, but also in cases, particularly with ADHD, to access medication. Presiding Officer, we recognise the need to address all of these issues quickly, but also, as I've been saying, we need to do this with sensitivity and rigour, recognising the complex and diverse nature of this issue. Members also have raised the importance of pathways, including adult pathways, and we are committed to ensuring adults receive support that is as consistent and responsive as possible. And recent work is helping us to move firmly in that direction. That is why we have accepted the full recommendations of the Adult Neurodevelopmental Pathways report and are working with partners on implementation. Our Autistic Adult Support Fund and our investment in the National Autism Implementation Team are already supporting more flexible, needs-based approaches for adults across Scotland. Members also rightly emphasise the lack of robust national data. Improving data is essential if we are to plan effectively, understand unmet need and support targeted investment. And I would just want to say, before I take an intervention from Mr Johnson, that work is already underway with health boards and local authorities to understand that data and what data is currently collected and how we can move towards a more coherent national approach. And I'm happy to confirm to Dr Kulhani in regards to the points that he raised that I have continued my ongoing engagement directly with health boards. Indeed, I was meeting with a health board just this morning and spoke at length about the importance of neurodevelopmental support and understanding the particular challenges and pressures that they are facing. I'm happy to give way to Mr Johnson.
So I'm grateful for the Minister giving me and what he said, and I think the important point on data. But can I just ask him about the pathways, because I think there are some very clear specific steps about actually having a consistent pathway, a four-stage pathway, most critically actually requesting sign guidance for ADHD, and then I think most fundamentally looking at actually who can do prescribing and at what point in the system. Are those specific points that the Minister has asked his officials to look at? Minister.
All of the issues Mr Johnson related to are part of the wider considerations. And as been touched on earlier, we do have the summit coming up on Monday, where we'll have an opportunity to discuss a lot of these issues in more detail. I noticed the time, Presiding Officer, I'm now over my allotted amount. I just want to again thank members for their contribution across the chamber. This is a significant challenge. It requires a response that is whole system, is whole society, but is ultimately and most importantly focused on the needs of the individual. I was just intending to conclude. I'm happy to take the intervention if you...
Very briefly, Michelle Thompson.
Extremely briefly, but in terms of returning to data, I genuinely consider it imperative that it's disaggregated by sex for the reasons I've outlined. Is he able to commit that that's part of his...
Minister.
That is absolutely something that needs to be considered as part of this process. And I think in terms of understanding any data, we would not want to just be limiting ourselves to sex, as important as that is for the reasons Michelle Thompson set out about the different presentations, particularly around masking, for example. So these are important points, but we would also, as has been touched on by other members, understanding the socio-economic implications as well. So there is a lot that we have to do around data, and I recognise that. But, Presiding Officer, I just again want to close by thanking members for their contributions, and I look forward to working constructively with members across Parliament and wider partners to improve our response. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting until 2 p.m. Thank you.